I still remember the exact sound my pen made when it touched that paper. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just a soft scratch across a clean white page. But that sound followed me into every sleepless night that came after. If you're listening to this right now and thinking, I always read what I sign, or, that could never happen to me, I want you to stay with me. Because I believe those same things. I believe them with my whole heart. My name is Richard Coleman. I'm 62 years old, born and raised in the Midwest, the kind of man who believed that if you worked hard, stayed honest, and trusted your family, life would eventually take care of you. I was wrong. Before I tell you how one signature destroyed my entire life, do me a small favor. If real stories about family betrayal, trust gone wrong, and quiet revenge pull you in, subscribe to this channel. And leave a comment telling me which city or country you're watching from. I read them all. And if you've ever trusted the wrong person, I want you to know, you're not alone. Now let me take you back to when my life still felt solid. Margaret and I had been married for 34 years. We met when we were young, broke, and hopeful. Built a life from nothing. 2 kids. A modest home. No luxury, but stability. I worked nearly 40 years in manufacturing. Same company. Same routine. Wake up early, pack lunch, come home tired but proud. Margaret handled the house. The bills. The paperwork. I trusted her with that because she was good at it, and because she was my wife. That trust never wavered. Not once. The house we lived in wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Paid off after decades of sacrifices. Missed vacations. Old cars driven longer than we should have. That house was supposed to be the place where we grew old together. On the afternoon everything changed, nothing felt wrong. The sun was coming through the kitchen window. I was sitting at the table, drinking coffee, reading the news on my phone. Margaret moved around the kitchen quietly, the same way she had for years. Then she placed a thin folder in front of me. "Rick," she said gently, "I need you to sign something." I didn't feel alarmed. I didn't feel suspicious. "Sign what?" I asked casually. "It's just paperwork," she said. "House stuff. It'll make things easier for us down the line." That was it. No tension. No urgency. No warning bells. I flipped through the pages. Dense legal language. Paragraphs that all looked the same. I trusted her. I always had. I remember hesitating for just a second. Not because I sensed danger, but because my coffee had gone cold. "Where do I sign?" I asked. She pointed to a line. And I signed. I didn't know that moment would replay in my head 1,000 times. For weeks after that, life went on as usual. Margaret cooked dinner. We watched TV. We talked about our kids. She seemed lighter somehow, less stressed, but I took that as a good sign. I thought whatever paperwork we'd handled had relieved some burden. I was proud of myself for being a supportive husband. Then the mail started piling up. At first, I ignored it. Banks send mail all the time. Statements. Notices. Nothing unusual. Until one envelope arrived marked certified mail. I opened it standing near the front door. And my stomach dropped. The words blurred together at first. Default. Collateral. Outstanding obligation. I read it again. Slowly this time. The house, our house, had been tied to a loan. A loan that hadn't been paid. A loan I knew nothing about. I felt heat rush to my face. My hands started shaking. That same day, I drove straight to the bank. The young man at the counter typed my name, then paused. His expression changed, subtle, but enough that I noticed. "Sir," he said carefully, "are you aware you're listed as a co-signer?" "Co-signer for what?" I asked. He turned the screen toward me. There it was. Primary borrower, Margaret Coleman. Co-signer, Richard Coleman. My ears started ringing. He explained it slowly, like he was afraid I might collapse right there. The house had been used as collateral for a private business loan. Payments had stopped months ago. Foreclosure proceedings were being prepared. I don't remember leaving the bank. I only remember sitting in my car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe. When I got home, Margaret was in the living room. I didn't yell. I didn't slam anything. I just asked one question. "What did you do?" She sat down slowly, like she had been expecting this moment. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she said. That sentence shattered something inside me. She told me about an investment, a business opportunity, someone she trusted. High returns, temporary risk. She needed money fast. And she needed my signature. "You used the house," I said quietly. She nodded. "You used me," I said. She didn't deny it. "I did what I had to do," she replied. That was the moment my marriage truly ended. Not with shouting. Not with divorce papers. But with the realization that the woman I trusted more than anyone else had decided my future without my knowledge, or my consent. Within weeks, everything unraveled. Accounts frozen. Friends growing distant. Whispers starting. Even my own children were confused, unsure who to believe. Margaret moved through the house like a stranger. And I started to understand something terrifying. That paper I signed wasn't a mistake. It was a trap. One carefully set by someone who knew exactly how much I trusted her. At 62 years old, I found myself sitting alone in a house I might lose, staring at my own signature on a document that was destroying me. That night, I laid the papers out on the table and studied them for the first time. And that's when I noticed something small. Something almost invisible. My signature didn't look right. And in that moment, I realized the truth might be far worse than I ever imagined. I stared at my signature for a long time that night. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Stress does that to a man. Fear plays tricks on your eyes. But the longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. The R in Richard was too sharp. The loop at the end was tighter than usual. And the pressure of the pen, it wasn't mine. I'd signed my name thousands of times in my life. Paychecks. Medical forms. Mortgage documents. Birthday cards. I knew my signature the way I knew my own voice. This one felt practiced. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought dread. Because if I was right, then this wasn't just a bad decision or a hidden loan. It meant something far worse. It meant I'd been manipulated. The next morning, I didn't confront Margaret. I didn't even look at her. I needed facts, not arguments. I drove to the county records office and requested copies of every document tied to our property. The clerk slid a thick stack of papers across the counter, barely looking at me. To her, it was just another request. To me, it was the anatomy of my downfall. Back home, I spread the documents across the dining table. Page after page. Dates. Names. Signatures. And there it was again. My name. Over and over. Some signatures looked like mine. Some didn't. And the differences weren't random. They were subtle. Careful. Almost respectful. Whoever did this knew me well. That night I slept on the couch. Not because Margaret asked me to, but because I couldn't lie next to her without wondering how long she'd been capable of this. The next week felt unreal. Margaret moved through the house like nothing had changed. She asked what I wanted for dinner. She commented on the weather. She talked about our son's job like we were still a normal couple. I answered when necessary. Nodded when required. Inside, I was pulling myself apart piece by piece. I called a handwriting analyst. A retired man who worked with law firms and insurance companies. He agreed to meet me after I emailed him copies of the documents. His office was small and smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. He studied the pages quietly, using a magnifying glass, measuring angles and pressure points. I sat across from him, hands clenched, waiting for a verdict I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. After nearly an hour, He looked up at me. Some of these signatures are yours, he said. My heart sank. But some of them, he continued, are not. I swallowed hard. How sure are you? He leaned back in his chair. Very. He explained it patiently. Pen lifts. Muscle memory. Speed inconsistencies. A practiced imitation. Not sloppy. Intentional. Someone had forged my signature. And they had done it well enough to pass casual scrutiny. I walked out of that office feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted. That evening, I finally confronted Margaret. I placed the documents on the table between us. I had these analyzed, I said. She looked at them, then at me. For a split second, just one, I saw fear flash across her face. Then it vanished. I don't know what you're implying, she said. Some of these signatures aren't mine, I replied calmly. And you know that. She stood up. You signed those papers. Not all of them, I said. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Finally, she spoke. You're overreacting. That was the moment I knew. People deny mistakes. They defend misunderstandings. But only guilty people dismiss evidence. The next day, I contacted a lawyer. Not a flashy one. Not a billboard name. Just a quiet man in his late 50s named Harold Myers, who listened more than he talked. He read everything. Slowly. Carefully. When he finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed his temples. Richard, he said, this isn't just a civil issue. What does that mean? I asked. It means fraud, he replied. Possibly identity misuse. And potentially criminal charges. The word criminal echoed in my mind. Margaret hadn't just endangered our future. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be erased. We filed an emergency motion to pause foreclosure proceedings. It didn't stop everything, but it bought time. Time to dig. And the more we dug, the uglier it got. The business Margaret claimed to be involved in. Not registered anywhere. The accounts? Opened under variations of names I didn't recognize. The money? Moved quickly. Deliberately. Like someone trying not to be followed. And my name was attached to everything. Friends started pulling away. People I'd known for years stopped returning calls. In a small town, rumors move faster than truth. One afternoon, my son Mark showed up unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, unsure how to speak to me. Mom says you knew about the loan, he said. That cut deeper than any accusation Margaret could have made. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I handed him the documents. The analyst's report. The bank letters. He read quietly. By the end, his hands were shaking. She told us you agreed, he whispered. That's what she needed you to believe, I said. He looked up at me, eyes full of doubt and regret. I didn't know who to trust, he said. Neither did I. Margaret moved out 2 weeks later. Packed her things calmly. No drama. No apology. She left me with the house, the debt, and the damage to my name. Court proceedings moved slowly. Painfully. Each hearing peeled back another layer of truth. Each document revealed another lie. Margaret's confidence started to crack. She avoided eye contact. Her lawyer whispered urgently during sessions. Plea deals were discussed. Then came the turning point. The analyst testified under oath. The bank officer followed. The forged signatures were undeniable. The judge ordered a criminal investigation. Margaret didn't look at me as they escorted her out that day. I didn't feel victory. I felt tired. Because justice doesn't restore what betrayal destroys. The house was removed from foreclosure. My name slowly cleared. Slowly. But the damage to my family. That would take much longer. One night, alone in the house, I realized something. I wasn't fighting for the house anymore. I was fighting for my dignity. And whatever came next, I would face it with my eyes open. Because when a man loses everything quietly, he learns to rebuild just as quietly. And I wasn't done yet. The house felt different after Margaret left. Not emptier, quieter in a way that made every sound too loud. The ticking clock in the hallway. The hum of the refrigerator. My own breathing when I sat still long enough to hear it. I walked from room to room like a guest in my own life. Closets half empty. Drawers with outlines where things used to be. A faint trace of her perfume still clinging to the bedroom, stubborn as memory. I slept on my side of the bed for a while, then moved to the couch. Not out of anger. Out of survival. Lying where she once slept made my chest tighten in ways I couldn't explain. The legal process dragged on, slow and methodical. Paperwork. Hearings. Waiting. Always waiting. And waiting gives your mind too much room to wander. I started replaying moments from the past, conversations that once seemed harmless now glowing with meaning. Times Margaret insisted on handling things herself. Moments she brushed off my questions with a smile and a gentle, "Don't worry about it." I had trusted that smile. Outside the house, life kept moving without me. Neighbors waved from a distance but didn't stop to talk. At the grocery store, conversations went quiet when I entered an aisle. People looked at me with that look, curious, cautious, unsure which version of the story to believe. In small towns, truth doesn't arrive first. Stories do. I became the man people whispered about. The husband who must have known. The fool who signed without reading. The guy whose marriage fell apart over money. None of them knew how lonely it feels to be misunderstood by an entire community. My children struggled the most. Mark came by occasionally, always polite, always careful with his words. Like he was afraid one wrong sentence might break something fragile between us. My daughter, Emily, stayed distant. Phone calls short. Texts polite but cold. Margaret still controlled parts of the narrative. Even from a distance. One evening, after a long day of meetings with my lawyer, I sat alone at the kitchen table and opened an old photo album. Pictures from birthdays. Vacations we couldn't really afford. Smiles that once felt permanent. I stopped at a photo of Margaret and me standing in front of the house, keys in our hands years ago. We looked proud. United. I closed the album. That version of us was gone. What hurt most wasn't the money. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was realizing how easily my life had been rewritten by someone else. Harold called one morning and asked me to come by his office. When I arrived, he had a stack of documents laid out neatly on his desk. "They've traced additional accounts," he said. "Some opened years ago." "Years?" I asked. He nodded. "This didn't start recently, Richard. It started quietly." That word again. Quietly. Margaret hadn't panicked and made one bad decision. She had planned. The loan that endangered our house was just the last move in a much longer game. Money had been siphoned off in small amounts. Statements redirected. Notices intercepted. All under the assumption that I trusted her completely. And I had. I felt something inside me harden, not into anger, but into clarity. I stopped asking why. I started asking how far. The investigation expanded. More interviews. More documents. More confirmation that this wasn't accidental. Friends I hadn't heard from in months suddenly called, offering vague support now that the truth was becoming harder to ignore. I thanked them politely. But I didn't forget who disappeared when things got uncomfortable. One afternoon, Emily finally came by. She stood in the doorway like she wasn't sure she belonged there anymore. We sat in silence for a long time. "I didn't know what to believe," she said finally. "I know," I replied. "She made it sound like you were controlling. Like you agreed to things and then changed your mind." I nodded slowly. "That's easier to believe than the alternative." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I should have asked you." "Maybe," I said gently. "But this isn't your fault." She reached across the table and took my hand. That small gesture felt heavier than anything that had happened in months. It was the first time I felt something close to relief. Margaret's court date approached. The house was officially safe for now, but I didn't feel attached to it anymore. It had become a symbol of something I needed to leave behind. I started packing slowly. Not rushing. Just preparing. On the morning of the hearing, I wore the same suit I'd worn to my father's funeral. It felt right. Like saying goodbye to something I couldn't name. Margaret looked smaller in the courtroom. Not weaker, just diminished. The confidence she once carried like armor had worn thin. When the evidence was laid out in full, there was no room left for denial. Forgery. Misrepresentation. Fraud. The words sounded clinical. Almost gentle. They weren't. Margaret didn't look at me when the judge spoke. When the decision came down, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt finality. That chapter of my life closed without ceremony. Afterward, I walked out alone. No press. No crowd. Just the sound of my own footsteps on concrete. I drove past the house one last time and kept going. I rented a small place on the edge of town. 1 bedroom. 1 chair. 1 window that caught the morning light. It wasn't much. But it was mine. Days settled into a new rhythm. Coffee and silence. Long walks. Evenings with books instead of television. I learned how to be alone without feeling abandoned. Months later, a letter arrived. Margaret's handwriting was unmistakable. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. She wrote about regret. About fear. About how things spiraled faster than she expected. About how she never meant to destroy me. At the bottom, she asked for forgiveness. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Not out of bitterness. Out of honesty. Forgiveness isn't a transaction. It's a process. And I wasn't there yet. What I had learned, though, was something far more valuable. Silence doesn't mean weakness. Patience doesn't mean ignorance. And rebuilding doesn't require permission from the people who broke you. I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. And for the first time since I signed that paper, I wasn't looking backward. I was finally looking ahead. Time has a strange way of settling things. Not all at once. Not loudly. Just steadily. After I moved into the small rental on the edge of town, the days began to blur together. No court dates. No lawyers calling. No envelopes that made my heart race. Just mornings that arrived whether I was ready or not. At first, I didn't know what to do with that silence. For decades, my life had been structured around responsibility, work schedules, bills, family needs, emergencies that demanded immediate attention. Now, there was nothing pulling at me. And that terrified me more than chaos ever had. I woke up early out of habit. Made coffee I didn't really taste. Sat by the window and watched the light crawl across the floor. Some mornings, I caught myself waiting for Margaret to walk into the room, annoyed that I'd left the cabinet door open. She never did. The quiet victory I'd imagined, justice, vindication, a sense of triumph, never arrived the way I expected. There was no moment where I raised my fists or felt redeemed. What came instead was understanding. Margaret hadn't just lost a case. She'd lost the version of herself she'd carefully constructed for years. Word travels fast when a story finally flips. People who once avoided me now nodded awkwardly when they passed. Some apologized. Some didn't. Most just wanted the discomfort to end. I didn't chase closure from them. I had learned something important. Not every wrong needs a conversation to be corrected. I focused on rebuilding quietly. I took a part-time job at a hardware store a few towns over. Nothing fancy. Stocking shelves. Helping customers find the right size bolt or the right shade of paint. No one there knew my past. And I liked it that way. I was just Richard. Not a headline. Not a rumor. Some evenings, I'd drive without a destination, just to feel the motion. Passing places Margaret and I used to go, restaurants, parks, stretches of road where memories still lingered like echoes. They hurt less now. Not because I'd forgotten, but because I'd stopped fighting them. One afternoon, I received a call from Harold. "I thought you should hear this from me," he said. Margaret's sentencing had been finalized. No dramatic prison term. No sensational punishment. Just enough time to mark her record forever. Enough to ensure every background check, every financial application, every attempt to rebuild her image would carry the weight of what she'd done. Consequences don't always look dramatic. Sometimes they look permanent. I thanked him and hung up. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt release. Because the revenge I once imagined, anger, exposure, humiliation, had turned into something quieter. Distance. Margaret wrote again, months later. This time, the letter was shorter. Less explanation. More honesty. She admitted she'd underestimated me. Assumed my silence meant ignorance. My trust meant blindness. She wrote, "I didn't think you would survive this." I folded the letter and placed it back in the drawer with the first one. Survival isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just continues. My children adjusted slowly. Mark visited more often. We talked about ordinary things, work, weather, life. The tension between us softened into something cautious but real. Emily called weekly. Sometimes just to talk. Sometimes just to sit in silence together on the phone. Healing doesn't erase scars. It teaches you how to live around them. One evening, I ran into an old neighbor at the grocery store. Someone who hadn't returned my calls during the worst of it. He hesitated before speaking. "I heard what really happened," he said. I nodded. "I'm sorry," he added. I believed him. But I didn't need it. That was another lesson I'd learned. Apologies are about the person giving them, not the one receiving them. As months passed, I noticed something unexpected. I wasn't angry anymore. The man who once lay awake replaying signatures and conversations was gone. In his place was someone calmer. Sharper. More aware. I trusted differently now. Not less, but wiser. I paid closer attention. Asked quiet questions. Read everything. Not because I was afraid, but because I respected myself enough to be careful. On a crisp autumn morning, I stood outside my old house, the one that was never really mine, even when I thought it was. The new owners were planting flowers. Laughing. Making plans. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt gratitude. Because that house represented a life built on assumptions. And I no longer lived that way. I drove back to my small place and opened the window. Cool air filled the room. I sat down with my coffee and realized something that surprised me. I was content. Not ecstatic. Not triumphant. Just steady. Margaret's name faded from daily thought. She became a chapter, not a presence. A lesson, not a wound. And the paper I once signed, the one that destroyed my life, had also done something else. It stripped everything down to the truth. Who stayed? Who left? Who I was, without the roles I'd hidden behind. Quiet revenge isn't about watching someone fall. It's about standing back up and walking away intact. And I had. The man who signed blindly was gone. The man who remained knew the value of silence, patience, and self-respect. And for the first time in a long time, my future didn't feel like something waiting to be taken from me. It felt like something I owned. I didn't realize how much my life had slowed down until one morning I caught myself smiling for no reason. No letter in the mail. No phone ringing with bad news. No memory crashing into my chest without warning. Just sunlight on the kitchen counter and the smell of coffee. For a long time after everything ended, I thought peace would feel bigger. Louder. More obvious. I imagined it like a finish line, something you cross and suddenly feel different. But peace doesn't arrive that way. It sneaks in quietly, the same way destruction does. I started noticing the small things first. Sleeping through the night without waking up tense. Making decisions without second-guessing myself. Trusting my own judgment again. That last one took the longest. Because when someone betrays you the way Margaret betrayed me, it doesn't just take your money or your stability. It makes you question your instincts, your intelligence, your worth. I had to rebuild all of that. Not in therapy rooms or dramatic confrontations, but in ordinary moments. Standing in line at the store and choosing patience. Helping a stranger lift a heavy box. Saying no when something didn't feel right, and not apologizing for it. I learned to listen to the quiet voice inside me again. The one I had ignored for years. My relationship with my children changed too. Not back to what it was, but into something more honest. Mark and I started meeting for breakfast once a week. No heavy conversations. Just eggs, coffee, and updates about life. Sometimes silence. Sometimes laughter. Emily invited me over one evening for dinner. Cooked a meal herself. Nervous, like she was afraid of doing something wrong. Halfway through the meal, she said, "I didn't realize how strong you were." I didn't answer right away. Strength isn't something you recognize while you're using it. It's something other people name later. "I didn't feel strong," I said. "I just didn't quit." That seemed to settle something between us. As the years moved forward, Margaret became a distant figure in my life. Occasionally, I heard updates through indirect channels. Jobs she couldn't get. Places she had to leave. Doors that stayed closed no matter how politely she knocked. I didn't celebrate that. I didn't mourn it either. I understood it. Actions don't end when consequences begin. They echo. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, I found the old folder, the one with copies of the documents that started everything. I sat down and flipped through them slowly. The forged signatures. The legal language. The line where my life had split in two. I thought about throwing them away. Instead, I placed them back in the drawer. Not as a reminder of pain, but as proof. Proof that I survived something meant to erase me. At 62, I thought my story was already written. Career behind me. Marriage settled. Life predictable. What I learned was that predictability can be the most dangerous illusion of all. We assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday. We assume the people closest to us will always protect us. We assume trust, once earned, doesn't need maintenance. I don't live that way anymore. I ask questions now. I read carefully. I pause when something feels rushed. Not because I'm afraid, but because I value my life too much to hand it over blindly again. And strangely enough, that awareness brought freedom. I started traveling short distances. Nothing fancy. Just places I'd never bothered to see before because I was always busy being responsible. I met people who knew nothing about my past, and didn't need to. To them, I was just a man with a calm voice and steady hands. That felt good. One evening, sitting alone on my porch, watching the sun dip below the trees, I thought about the man I used to be. The man who signed without reading. The man who believed loyalty required silence. The man who thought love meant never questioning. I don't judge him anymore. He did the best he could with what he knew at the time. But I'm not him now. Now I understand something most people only learn too late. Trust is powerful, but it must be mutual. Love is generous, but it must be honest. And peace is worth more than being right. I signed one paper, and lost my whole life. But I also gained something unexpected. Clarity. I learned who I was without the roles I'd hidden behind. Without being someone's husband. Someone's provider. Someone's safety net. Just me. And that turned out to be enough. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to take away from this, it's this. Pay attention to the quiet moments. They tell you more than arguments ever will. Read what you sign. Listen when something feels off. And never confuse loyalty with self-sacrifice. Because your life, your real life, isn't something you should ever give away without knowing the cost. I didn't get my old life back. I built a better one. And this time, it belongs to me.